Greetings, everybody. My name is Jim Henry, and I'm a professor at Western Michigan University in the School of Social Work, and I'm also the director of the Southwest Michigan Children's Trauma Assessment Center. And I've been working here in Wayne County for the last 5 years in bringing trauma-informed practices across Wayne, including the city of Detroit as a focus. Today, the topic is on historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. These are very significant understandings in terms of understanding what happens to our kids, what happens to parents as they parent, and what happens to a culture or a race in terms of historical trauma events that impact generations. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'd like to start with a recognition of this first slide that the intergenerational transmission of trauma occurs through the recognition of the emotional and ancestral sufferings of past generations. This is essential because it really frames what and how a group of people can experience trauma and ultimately have that passed on from generation to generation. And the way I'd like to talk about that is we can talk about through African American history, we can talk about it through Native American history. One of the slides I'll be showing is the impact of the Holocaust on the Jewish people and those who experienced that. But it really, in talking about historical trauma, it's being able to appreciate how a set of events that may have happened 50, 100 years ago that didn't happen to you personally can still be impacting you. And certainly with African American, when we talk about slavery in this country, in terms of how it's affected African Americans as a people, as in terms of their struggle for civil rights and the wounds and scars of the sometimes horrors that happened to them as a people, and how that continues to be passed on and potentially impact. The other part of this is just my own recognition, especially working in Wayne County and the city of Detroit as a focus. As a white man, as a man of privilege, it's a very different experience that I've had growing up than if I was African American or if I was a woman, especially an African American woman. And so I want to say this and speak to historical trauma as a way to honor and as the term culture of humility of how do we learn from each other, but really coming from a position of how I share this is definitely as somebody who wants to learn, but also honor that historical trauma is real and it's something that I have not experienced. So when we're talking about what we're looking at for those of you who work in mental health or in service provision, it's really saying that the current generation, again, the offspring of those who have experienced historical trauma as a people, that it continues to affect individual and familial mental health and functioning. And there's 3 sites here, and there are several others that work has been done to really say, how does that, those experiences of the past shape and continue to shape even those adults now or children who weren't a part of that, but it has impacted their belief about themselves, the way they function, and certainly the belief about society at large. There's a burgeoning field called epigenetics. And epigenetics is really understanding how the genetic structure of an individual can change when chronically exposed to traumatic events and the subsequent stress that happens from those events. And this is very significant for a couple reasons, is that it is biological. And this first bullet here, it says a biological mechanism for short-term adaptation but long-term consequences, means that in the short term, when we're confronted with danger, we have a release of cortisol. Our brain is impacted into fight flight, and that chronic exposure helps to keep us on this constant alert for danger, even though events are over that were dangerous. But now with this genetic structure change, that because of the continuous release of cortisol, where there has been a long-term set of traumatic events, that this really does change the biology, which is very significant. So it's not just looked at as a mental health problem. It is looked as a neurobiological issue that we really have to recognize that this can be passed on then from generation to generation. As my genetics change, so might my children's, because of the genetics now that I bring after that have been impacted by my environment, and specifically chronic exposure to traumatic stress. The other now, this is that study that I was telling you about that Rachel Hyunda did about looking at survivors of the Holocaust and then looking at their offspring. And as you can see here from that first bullet, she did this study, and one of the things she found is that children who are now adults of Holocaust survivors reported feeling traumatized by exposure to their parents' traumatic symptoms. So they brought the Holocaust experience to their current family, their children when they were born after the Holocaust. But certainly they were impacted. And as a culture, they dealt with that is in terms of events that they remembered, but also individually. And children in this study really reported that that impacted their perception of themselves and the world by what their parents had experienced. The other part of this, and I thought was very interesting, is that when we talk about how this affected the offspring, that some of them were traumatized by the parental expectation that you were the reason that I survived. In other words, the meaning of my life, if I'm a Holocaust survivor, was that I might bear children, that I might give my children a life, and that they might be safe. And so this tremendous weight or burden, or sometimes we call this survivor's guilt, was experienced by many of the Holocaust survivor offspring and really impacted their own developmental process, as you'll see in the next slide. So I think this really speaks to just what I was saying. The bullet is that these offsprings were 3 times more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder if exposed to a traumatic event versus a non-Holocaust survivor child who experienced a traumatic event that was much less likely to be impacted. So what that means is basically if my parent was a Holocaust survivor, that I was 3 times more likely, even though I might have experienced the same potentially traumatic event as somebody else, if that person hadn't come from a family where they had experienced the Holocaust, the likelihood that I would experience these symptoms of PTSD was increased 3-fold. And what are those symptoms? 1, it's intrusive thoughts, meaning this ongoing continuum of intrusive thoughts at different moments about the traumatic event. 2 is avoidance, the inability to respond to any stimuli that's associated with the trauma, avoidance of a neighborhood, avoidance of a person, avoidance of a particular ritual that I might have used prior to the trauma. And then the third part of this in a PTSD is the hyperarousal. So in other words, this constant looking for danger, this constant fear that harm is going to come. And so when we talk about this historical trauma, this wave keeps on impacting generation to generation. And this was one example that I thought was important and necessary to do. If we look at a quote, and I thought this quote really summarized what I just said, it says, and this was from a Holocaust offspring, "I have poor shock absorbers and I should let it pass because my biology is going to have extreme responses before it calms down." Now, what does this mean? It's just kind of an important way to talk in a very genuine manner that my biology, my shock absorbers, have been impacted, so they're more likely to have extreme response, knowing that that's how my body responds because of that history that I've had through my parent or parents. And so even though it may not have happened to me, again, specifically because it happened to my parents, I carry it in my body, I carry it in my biology. And so I'm going to be more reactive than someone else. But I have to know this so that I don't, react or move into my own fight flight to say that this is just now how I'm wired. And so therefore, being aware of that really opens the door to being able to more genuinely think through and calm myself and to know that I'm okay. There's a quote by a guy named Daniel Siegel, who's a brain expert, and he says, to name something is to begin to tame it. And I think this statement here by a Holocaust offspring really does that, to say, I just know that I'm going to be more in my body reactive to events because of what I experienced, what I've experienced through my parents, not what I've particularly experienced myself personally. So a couple more sites here. So as we look at this one, at the community level, breakdown of traditional cultural and values, loss of rites of passage, high rates of alcoholism, and rates of physical illness and internalized racism often occurs, that what we know about historical trauma can break down the fabric of a culture. It can break down the rituals. It can break down the safety. And so as a people, we're no longer safe. And as a people then, it really then creates this ongoing vulnerability. And so when we talk about that, you know, culture gives us meaning. And if we don't have the culture within which we as a people are embedded, then we are much more vulnerable to things outside of that culture that really create deterioration. And certainly when we look at the ACEs study that most all people are familiar with out of San Diego, it looked at adverse child experiences. And what they found was that the more adverse child experiences a person had growing up as a child, the more likely they were for early death, high rates of physical illness, including diabetes, social emotional issues, and substance abuse. So this is really kind of paralleling what we know happens to individuals as they develop when they actually experience, versus a community breakdown where we don't have those safe markers, that empowerment, that efficacy, and so it translates into individual lives. This is kind of a slide that really speaks to, I think, what I've been sharing, but really kind of breaks it down into very specific symptomology. So as we can see, the individual responses of the next generation include rumination over the past, that how do we get out of this? It happened to my parents, it happened to me. I was with a group of women, actually from Detroit, 14 African-American women, who clearly told me that one of their fears was something bad or, quote, traumatic happening to their child. And the context of that was talking about what trauma is. And many of the women said, this happened to my grandmother, this traumatic event happened to my mother, this traumatic event happened to me. How do I protect my child from, quote, not having that traumatic event? And I think this is one of those hypervigilant awarenesses of this history. And one of the women who's a leader who is very knowledgeable about trauma shared with me, which was very new to me, of, you know, that sometimes in the ghetto that was talked about as this kind of generational, as the curse, and the curse meaning something that continues to happen and there's no way to stop that. And Cheryl, who was the leader, spoke eloquently to say, well, now we know it's not a curse, it's trauma, and it can certainly be passed down through generations and impact the vulnerability of people, and certainly exacerbate that sense of fear and danger that is ever present, which can result in, as we see, some of the symptoms of depression and numbness. If we look at Native Americans and we talk about this, I think it's really important that one of the things that they can teach us is those who have really healed from that historical trauma have been successful because they've included deep attachments to others. So in other words, the relationships that in any study that we look at about resiliency, relationships that are positive, that communicate a reciprocal care are foundational to overcoming any adversity. And so tribal members who as a group band together to strengthen one another. Second one was holding to traditional values. And traditional values are those things that, again, as I said earlier, give us meaning, but they also give us hope.